We acknowledge that we are on the unceded ancestral homeland of the Ramaytush Ohlone, who are the original inhabitants of the San Francisco Peninsula. As the indigenous stewards of this land, and in accordance with their traditions, the Ramaytush Ohlone have never ceded, lost, nor forgotten their responsibilities as the caretakers of this place, as well as for all peoples who reside in their traditional territory. As guests, we recognize that we benefit from living and working on their traditional homeland. We wish to pay our respects by acknowledging the ancestors, elders, and relatives of the Ramaytush Ohlone community, and by affirming their sovereign rights as First Peoples. Thank you everyone for joining us today for our Expanding Housing Choice Phase 2 webinar. Our project has three main phases. Our first phase focused on community engagement, along with developing and sharing initial zoning concepts that we held over the summer and fall of this year. Today, we will share updates and information from the second phase of the Housing Element Zoning Program and highlight progress made on the objective design standards. During the winter and spring of 2024, during phase 3, we will bring a final proposal to the decision makers for adoption. So please remember to use the Q&A function to submit your questions throughout the session. We will be collecting them and throughout and during the Q&A, share those with our panelists. My name is David Garcia. I work as a planner on the project, and our panelists are Joshua Switsky, Acting Director of the Citywide Division in SF Planning, Lisa Chen, Principal Planner and Project Manager for the Expanding Housing Choice Program, and Trent Greenan, Senior Architect and Urban Designer, who will share a brief presentation and answer questions you all submit to us via the questions feature. Before we begin the presentation, I will ask Joshua Switsky to share some words.
Thank you, David. Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for the introduction, David. Thank you for taking the time over your lunch hour, if you're eating lunch, or out of your work day, to join us for this event. Thank you for joining us again. If you came to one of our previous public workshops or participated in a focus group, we really appreciate your ongoing engagement with us on this really generational effort. And for those who are joining us for the first time, thank you for coming. The Expanding Housing Choice Zoning Program is one of the key implementation actions of our recently equity-centered adopted housing element, which lays out how the city will meet its housing needs over the next decade for both existing and future residents. You may be aware that this is both a mandate from the state that we do this, but it's also an important city set of policies and objectives, and Mayor London Breed's recent Housing for All executive directive really directs us to produce this zoning program early in 2024 so that we can meet our needs as soon as possible and expand opportunities for people to live all over the city. So that people of all means can find a home throughout San Francisco. Despite the urgency, our goal is always to balance the need to meet our needs as soon as possible with extensive and detailed technical analysis and a thorough community engagement process that we can hear from everyone and have a dialogue. So we hope you continue to stay engaged in this process, which will take us into 2024 because there's a lot of important details to work out. So with that, it's my pleasure to hand it over to Lisa Chen and then to Trent Greenan, who will be providing more information on the rezoning program and the objective design standards. So thank you, Lisa.
All right, thank you, Josh. And thank you all for being here. I definitely see some familiar names in the attendees. So just to echo Josh, we really do appreciate all the feedback that we've been receiving so far. So I'm Lisa Chen with the Planning Department. And so we have kind of a two-part presentation. I'm going to open with more of a high-level update on the project, including summarizing some of our outreach over the past year. and then presenting the draft zoning map, which many of you have probably already seen, that we shared this fall. And then I'm going to hand it over to Trent Greenan, who's going to take a deeper dive into the objective design standards specifically, which we are developing in parallel with the rezoning. Next. So if you've been to our events before, you know we always like to center the conversation by talking about the types of people that we're really working to expand housing choice for. So over the course of the housing element and now the housing element rezoning, and through many of our other community planning processes, we've heard from thousands of San Franciscans about the housing challenges that they face. Next. So the words that you see here are from interviews that our team conducted over the summer with a range of people, and in particular, the types of people who really make our city run, but really have challenges finding and keeping their housing in the city. So for example, we've spoken with first responders who are increasingly moving out of the city and even out of the region, and who might not be nearby during times of emergency. Educators who are also struggling to work in the communities they serve, and who also see how their school communities are impacted by our affordable housing crisis. And people in our building trades who are building the housing we need, but may be commuting for many hours to get here. We had the honor of working with a local artist, Michelle McNeil. She's the in-house designer for the San Francisco Human Rights Commission. And she created these illustrations that use quotes that we heard during the housing element, and really bring to life some of the challenges that people shared with us. And you may have seen some of these images on muni buses and on social media or in the newspaper to promote our events. So these stories are not unique to San Francisco. This really is a trend that we've seen statewide. And over the past several years, lawmakers have really responded to that call by passing a whole range of policies that are really aimed at expanding production of housing statewide, and in particular, affordable housing. So our California statewide housing plan was adopted in 2022. And it essentially set a target of 2.5 million housing units that cities and counties need to produce working to produce over the next decade to meet our affordable housing needs, including 1 million affordable units. So of that larger amount, San Francisco's share is roughly 82,000 housing units. And when we account for our pipeline and other development that we just expect to happen, that leaves us with a gap of roughly 36,000 housing units. So the city itself is not actually building housing, that happens through for-profit and nonprofit housing developers, but our role is to create the capacity for that by changing our zoning to allow it to happen, and then changing our processes to facilitate that housing. Directly after this statewide housing plan, we, as a city, we unanimously adopted our housing element. So that was adopted earlier this year, following a 3-year outreach process. And it really is a comprehensive roadmap, as Josh noted, for how we're going to meet our housing needs. So it includes over 350 actions that city agencies are actively working towards to meet our housing goals. Many of which are clustered into these 4 areas that are highlighted in the Mayor's Housing for All initiative. So in addition to expanding housing choice, we are also actively working to fund and implement affordable housing. We are also partnering with equity communities on implementation, and we are working to reform our approval and adoption processes to facilitate housing production. The rezoning itself is grounded in the need to grapple with our exclusionary past. So for those of you who are somewhat familiar with zoning history and planning history, you might know that in our early days of our city, we did have more flexible zoning that allowed housing to be produced, different types of housing to be produced throughout the city. But then gradually over the course of the 20th century, rules were introduced that started to tighten and exclude certain types of housing, and in particular, multifamily housing, apartment buildings that really were more affordable than single-family homes. So in more recent years, we have started to reverse that trend and have adopted a range of area plans throughout largely the southeast part of the city, so close to downtown and along the southeastern waterfront. And that's really where we've seen housing built over the past 2 decades, as shown in the map in orange. In contrast, on the map on the right, these are the housing opportunity areas that are designated by the state as having a lot of great opportunities for residents. So they have higher incomes, better school performance, and low pollution exposure. So these areas make up over half of our residential areas, but we've only seen 10% of our housing built in these areas over the past couple decades. Next. So our mandate from the state is really to start to undo and redress these trends. And so our goal here is really to create housing opportunities in these areas, similar to what we've already done in the eastern part of the city. So we are going to continue to see tens of thousands of housing units built outside of the housing opportunity areas, but really what we're trying to do is create a level playing field. And so the way we're doing that is that we're planning for a minimum of 36,000 housing units on transit streets, commercial streets, and other key sites throughout the housing opportunity areas, which are shown here. And as Josh noted, we are on an ambitious timeline. We're supposed to have a proposal by early next year for policymakers to consider. And the idea is that by moving this forward on an ambitious timeline, we can hopefully start to create more opportunities for housing development and get us closer to meeting our housing targets. So we have received questions about, whether the rezoning is actually necessary and what would happen if we don't adopt the rezoning. So there are a number of consequences from the state if we do not implement this or other key provisions of the housing element. First of all, there's a lot of state funding programs and grants that are really predicated on having a certified housing element. So we could lose, hundreds of millions of dollars in funding for various infrastructure, including transportation and affordable housing. We could also be at risk of fines and lawsuits, which we have started to see in some other communities that don't have a certified housing element. And we could also lose control over local permitting, which is the so-called builder's remedy, which means that the state would basically require us to approve any housing that's meeting basic safety standards. Next. So even though, we do need to do this, we are required to do this, we also just want to emphasize that we're not only doing this because it's a requirement. I think as others have noted, we also do think this is in line with our values as an inclusive city, as a city that's working towards equitable outcomes. And that's really what we've also heard during our community engagement over the past year. So this is a snapshot of the range of events that our team has been working on over the year. It's included, the very large events like our open houses and the survey, and then smaller events, kind of more one-on-one with neighborhood groups and also focus groups. Next slide. And some of the key themes that we've heard, we really did hear that people acknowledge that our housing system isn't working. And in particular, we need to be thinking about how we can expand access to affordable housing, how we can support existing tenants and small businesses. We did hear, kind of different ideas about how to actually do that, though, and in particular, mixed reactions to the idea of adding greater heights and density in these neighborhoods. So we did hear from many people who are just very supportive of adding more housing, including adding housing beyond what we've shown on our maps. And then we've heard from others who continue to share a lot of concerns about seeing these neighborhoods change and adding more growth. We did also hear concerns about our housing approval process itself, and just really emphasizing what some of the state requirements that are coming down the pike, and making sure that we're really enabling this housing to happen quickly, as well as concerns about infrastructure and services that are needed in these neighborhoods as they grow. Next slide. So these are the maps that we shared in the summer, so during our first round of outreach. And they were meant to kind of show different ideas to solicit feedback on people's priorities and concerns. And so the key difference between these two maps is that the map on the left has these dark blue buffer areas off of the corridor. So essentially what it's doing is it's kind of spreading the growth more gradually throughout the neighborhoods. But it's the same corridors we're talking about here. The map on the right, it's really kind of just concentrating the growth on the corridors themselves and has slightly higher heights as a result. Next. So this is the map that we shared last month during our open houses. And so this is really trying to encompass the range of feedback that we got, which, I noted, was very mixed. But kind of what we did here very clearly is, the desire to really, focus on community benefits. So things like affordable housing and such, and also to really, protect our existing tenants as well. And so part of that strategy that we're reflecting here is a focus on the corridors themselves. So we have, kind of kept the new growth concentrated on the corridors. We have also increased the heights in some locations in response to feedback, and have added some areas that we missed during the first round of feedback as well. So, for example, we've added sections of Irving Street, Ocean Ave, Balboa, and so on. So, by kind of concentrating the growth on the corridors themselves, we think that is a really smart strategy. That's where there are more large sites that are kind of more efficient and more, developable. And, it also kind of limits, existing housing uses as well. I will also just note that the maps, that the heights that you see here, I know it's hard to see on the screen. This is also on our website. We have an interactive map. You can zoom into the parcel level and really see this proposal. But the heights that we show here are meant to be the final desired heights. So we're essentially baking in bonuses like the state density bonus. So we'll be working backwards, from the state density bonus and kind of setting baseline zoning changes. From there, we are actually creating a local program as part of this effort, and then projects will have the flexibility to choose either the state program or our local program. Next slide. And we're not going to get into all of the specifics of the local program right now. We are planning to come back in January, where we have planning commission hearings scheduled. We'll be going through some of the details of the local program in more depth. But this is just to kind of give you a snapshot of some of the topics that we're working to integrate through this. So we are really, kind of modeling this program off of the state density bonus. We're looking at some of the projects that have used that program and trying to build some of that flexibility into the local program. And kind of the key thing that we're adding on top of that is we're also adding flexibility around certain areas and also trying to advance certain local policy goals. So, for example, we are trying to create through our local program a lot of flexibility around affordable housing. Right now through the state program, it really prioritizes on-site housing development, affordable housing development, which is how you actually get the bonus. But here we really want to create flexible options so that we see projects that are paying affordable housing fees, which then go to nonprofit housing developers. We also want to see if we can incentivize rental housing and maybe rent-controlled housing as well. And then we are also looking at a range of other policy goals. So first and foremost, thinking about the process itself and making sure that as many projects are eligible for by right and ministerial review. We are also looking at objective design standards, which we're going to delve into shortly. And then also reviewing all of our policies around tenant protections and demolition controls, supporting small businesses, and also protecting historic uses. Next slide. And just to kind of close out this portion, we do want to just kind of give an idea of what some of these corridors could look like as housing comes online. And so we have been working with AECOM, one of our consultants, to start to create these sort of visualizations that show this organic kind of change that can happen in the neighborhoods as we have existing uses and then some of these newer buildings coming online. So this view is from Geary Boulevard around 4th Avenue. Sorry, that's a typo. And it's showing heights of 85 to 140. And this next view is from Noriega and 25th Avenue. And the building you see here is around 65 feet. And we're going to be creating more of these visualizations from other parts of the rezoning. And, I think they also just illustrate some of the kind of public improvements like infrastructure and bike and ped improvements that can also really support these neighborhoods as they grow. Next slide. So I'm going to just touch on our next steps and then hand it over to Trent. So as we've noted, we are kind of wrapping up our phase 2 of outreach. And so we do have 2 online surveys that are up on our website now. So a phase 2 survey that is asking for specific feedback on the zoning proposal and kind of some of the related topics. And then we also have a business that's geared specifically towards small business owners and merchants associations. Both of those are live until December 22nd. And then we are also continuing to do community conversations, which are one-on-one meetings with neighborhood groups. So you can contact us through the website or email us at this address to request one of those. And then starting early next year, we are going to be moving towards our adoption process. So we'll have informational and adoption hearings first at the Planning Commission and then moving on to the board. And the best way to stay in touch with us or to stay updated is to go onto our website and sign up for our email list to get updates. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Trent.
Thank you, Lisa. And my name is Trent Greenan. I'm an architect here at the San Francisco Planning Department. So I'm pleased to be here to present some of the highlights from the draft corridor design standards that we're currently developing. These will address primarily buildings of 65 to 85 feet tall along the corridors, and they will replace the existing urban design guidelines, or which is what we currently use for design review on projects. They will also allow for ministerial approval of projects within the high-resourced area. In addition to the outreach that Lisa mentioned, the open houses and the Planning Commission informational, we've also reached out to the development community. I think some of you are with us today. And so we're soliciting feedback from all corners, and what we're showing today does not necessarily incorporate all the feedback we've received so far, but we continue to update it. And so all the comments that we get from you are critical to the success of these. Overall, we're trying to take a very light approach with the standards and really focusing on some key elements that we feel are important for good urban design and architecture. Additionally, we're collecting data from past state density bonus projects to determine which concessions and waivers are most commonly sought so that we can have the standards respond to those and maybe incorporate some of that, because we do want these standards, which will be part of the local program, to be appealing to developers and to be a good alternative to the state density bonus. So moving on, standards are broken down into 2 primary categories: site design. Site design looks at how buildings are placed on the site, their overall layout, in addition to things like ground floor setbacks, upper floor step backs, and so forth. So we've basically developed a hypothetical model of a corridor section that shows what an ultimate build out may look like, with some existing buildings, historic buildings, and some newer buildings incorporated. And looking at the next slide. So front and side step backs, overall, the approach we're taking is that corridors are in the city, you have the width to support tall buildings. So we're sort of focusing the volumes towards the corridor itself. So not necessarily requiring many step backs at the upper floors, but allow these buildings to go up to, say, 85 feet at the back of sidewalk before any mass reductions might be incorporated. So we know that most streets in the city, this is a typical development style. So it really creates a dynamic streetscape with the, mixing of some older historic buildings and fabric buildings, and in addition to newer ones. And that's sort of what the image shows here, is sort of a mix of both of those. And then stepping down on the side to lower buildings is typically not required, but we'll look at one instance later where we think that might be appropriate. And then we are focusing a lot of attention on articulation and less so in modulation, right? So we know that buildings on corridors can extend for decent lengths without having to be broken up unnecessarily. So next slide, please. So rear step backs, this is where the relationship between the higher new buildings and the existing neighborhoods is the most sensitive, and where we, want to try to provide some transition from these taller buildings, again, going up to 85 feet at the corridor. There are some instances where taller buildings are allowed, but those will likely require some reductions in scale above 85 feet. So this will allow, if we allow buildings to extend 65 feet to the depth of the lot, if we look at a typical 100-foot deep lot, we know there's a variety of lots, but just looking at this scenario, would allow for double loaded units facing the corridor and behind. So we want to make sure that we allow for typical development programs in these standards. And then we're suggesting that between the 65% depth and the 25% rear yard, that potentially we would have a step down there that sort of moderates the scale of the lower existing development to the taller buildings on the corridors. And they're also looking at standardizing things like roof decks and light wells, which are commonly applied as part of urban design guidelines. Next slide, please. And then overall, the standards, we want to provide flexibility in how the standards can be met. So looking at rear yards, one approach might be just having, a standard 25% rear yard, which is what currently exists in the NC districts. And we've heard some great feedback from the development community about, maybe there's some flexibility here. So we're thinking about that. And again, we're looking at other state density bonus projects to determine, maybe there's some common ground there we can find. And the ground floor podium may extend in full depth of the lot. Next slide, please. And then the L-shape configuration would be another option that developers could use, and this would basically align the rear yard with the existing mid-block open space. So in deeper corner lots, this would allow you to turn the corner to the side street, so prevents a large blank gap between the development. Next slide, please. And then side setbacks, really. This is the condition where you have a common condition is where existing single family homes sort of side up to the corridor. Now these properties will be rezoned as well, but there might be instances where this will be a pattern for some time. So allowing some step down to these rear yards would do a couple of things: provide some relief to those homes, but it also prevents a sheer blank wall to the full building height, allowing for better exposure and opportunities for open space at the upper levels of the new project. Next slide, please. And then large sites. This is something that's very much in development, but we want to make sure, obviously, when you have very large sites, that it can be broken down into the scale of existing blocks within the city, and requiring things such as paseos for large block cut-throughs. Next slide, please. And then moving on to architecture. Next slide, please. Facade articulation. Again, this is an area where we want to provide some emphasis, and I think just by looking at successful buildings around the city, I think we've incorporated some elements that I think would apply to most buildings, and these might be, for example, a major projection or recession spaced at say 30 feet apart on the corridor. This may include balconies or terraces or a major volume offset. Or it could be regularly spaced smaller elements, such as deeply recessed windows, a highly textured facade, projecting elements such as sunshades, fins, louvers, or so forth. So I think you'll find that most buildings, currently meet this, but we want to provide flexibility again in how this can be achieved. Next slide, please. And again, ground floor commercial, we want to give some emphasis to this. This is where pedestrians interact with the building. So its treatment is really integral to creating a rich and vibrant streetscape environment. And there are some fundamental elements of ground floor storefront design that we're recommending including here, including articulating bays, separating a transom window from the storefront window, providing a minimal bulkhead at the base of the storefront, and recessing entries. Next slide, please. And then again, for residential, we require that most entries to residential have a entry from the street in the form of stoops, but we also want to allow for at-grade entries for accessibility. So requiring entries to be set back behind a landscape strip, either raised above the sidewalk or recessed in the instance where it would be at the grade. These are elements we know that provide a very comfortable transition from the sidewalk into the private unit. Next slide, please. And fenestration, we know how important windows are to overall building quality, so we'll be requiring some, fundamental elements that we feel are important to achieve this. And having minimum and maximum transparency requirements, there will be a lot of flexibility within this range, and do not feel this will be constraining at all. Having all rooms facing a street, having operable windows, and then also requiring a 3-inch shadow line for windows. This could be achieved by recessing the window 3 inches or having a window box around it. And this is something we've worked with architects in the past to achieve, and I think it's been successful so far. Next slide, please. So the next steps again are, this latest draft doesn't necessarily reflect all feedback we've had, but once we solicit everything, we're moving into the next stage, and we'll be reaching out again to the development community. There will be more opportunities at the Planning Commission to comment, and as Lisa mentioned, we will be looking for adoption in the first part of 2024. So it's a very quick process, and any feedback we receive from you is really super appreciated, so don't hold back in any comments. So I'm going to hand it back over to David. Thank you.
So they're still looking for a tenant.
Thank you so much, both Lisa and Trent, for your presentations. Now we're going to switch over to your questions. So we've gotten so many comments and questions in the chat. Right now we're going through and organizing them. So as we continue to do that, please continue to put those questions in the chat. Also know that we'll continue to be in touch through different means. So if you don't feel that your question's answered today, please continue to be in touch. We'll make sure to share our contact information so you have it. So to get us started, if you could, anyone on our panel, many of our participants shared the priority of affordable housing and how affordable housing units will be created in this process. How are we supporting the affordable housing that we talked about in the presentation and that we all know is very sorely needed across our communities?
I can start that, and then, Josh, please feel free to chime in as well. So, I think this is the central challenge that we're really facing is, in particular, how can we provide sufficient resources to build our affordable housing needs? And so it's a multi-layered approach. So we do have inclusionary housing requirements that essentially require market rate developers to chip in for affordable housing. Those were recently revised. So the current percentages that are required for new projects are essentially 15% if you're providing on-site affordable units, or 20.5% if you're paying a fee. That fee then goes to MoCD, who then basically grants that money out to nonprofit affordable housing developers to build an equivalent number of units. So the percentage is actually slightly higher if you're paying the fee. So that's obviously not going to get us to our goal, which is, basically half of our housing being affordable. So we really need to look at all different options for doing that. San Francisco has traditionally been very strong in building affordable housing. So, we, in our recent letter to HCD, for example, I think we noted that, even though we're something like 11% of the population of the Bay Area, we've been providing, something like 30% of the affordable units in the region over, the past cycle. So we're definitely punching above our weight, but we need to do more to meet these ambitious targets. So, there are a couple bond measures that are, in the works for a local bond measure for the city, and then a regional bond measure, which is, I think, predicted to raise something like $10 billion for affordable housing. But we are also going to need other resources. So, I think a big part of this is also advocacy to the state, advocacy to the federal government for more resources for affordable housing in particular. And I'll just also point out that we have an Affordable Housing Leadership Council, which was another implementation measure from the housing element. So that process is happening right now. And essentially, the mayor has convened, some of the key leaders in terms of our philanthropists, our nonprofit developers, for-profit developers, to come up with all of the ideas for how we can start to meet these targets. And so they're going to be issuing their recommendations early next year.
Thank you, Lisa. And to dive into that a little bit deeper, we did get some questions, particularly about District 2, for example, which is in our housing opportunity area. So if we can, a participant asked, how will building an expensive, tall condo building in our neighborhoods provide for any significant numbers of affordable housing units? And why would these be so concentrated in an area like D2? So Joshua, if you would like to delve into that a little bit deeper, or Lisa?
Sure, I'll get it started. Well, the focus, I think, as Lisa described early in the presentation, the focus of this geography in the city is, as described in the housing element, is intended to what's called affirmatively further fair housing, which is to provide opportunity for multifamily housing in neighborhoods that have higher resources in terms of access to jobs, to transit, have good outcomes for people in terms of schools, have low pollution. And these are districts in the city that have not produced much housing over the last several decades. And so both state guidance and our own kind of equity-focused policies that are laid out in the housing element encourage us to identify opportunities for multifamily housing in these neighborhoods. And more generally, we have inclusionary housing requirements, and so to the extent that we get larger projects, they produce affordable housing directly, in addition to providing other resources. And generally, more housing that gets produced, just generally regionally, kind of mitigates, the rise of prices overall for everybody. So, we do recognize that individually, some of these units will not be affordable for lower income folks in and of themselves. They do produce inclusionary units and provide a general mitigation for people looking for housing in the open market to alleviate some of the price rises from the pressures of population growth and job growth and things like that.
The only thing I would add is that, a big part of our goals are also to just expand the diversity of housing types in many of these neighborhoods. The data very clearly shows that single family homes tend to be the most expensive housing types. And so when we don't have, more diversity, so in addition to kind of, the mid-rise and high-rise housing that we're talking about on the corridors, there's other efforts that have been adopted or are proposed to expand things like ADUs and fourplexes and sixplexes. In some of these neighborhoods, we have seen things like townhomes and other kind of missing middle housing types. And so we definitely want to start to see more of those as well, just to kind of expand what's out there at different price points, and then also meeting different needs, right? Because something we've also heard during our outreach is just some people feel stuck in their housing types. They want to move into other housing types and aren't seeing them in their neighborhoods.
Thank you, Lisa and Joshua. In continuing on people's needs and the impacts that the new housing can have, both on the existing communities and for future residents, could we speak to what the impacts and how those impacts have been measured in this process? Everything from schools to hospitals to resources such as parks and open space. Could we share a little bit more of what that process is like and what the findings are based on it?
Sure, I'll get us started on that question. So a couple points. One, there was an environmental impact report that was done on the housing element itself and all of the projected growth that would come over the years from that, and identified, areas where the city may be deficient. Fortunately, we do have substantial capacity to carry us through some years on several aspects on those, and it identified some places where, at some point in the future, the city would need to invest in increasing its capacity. For instance, there is substantial capacity in the Southwest treatment plant to handle a lot more sewage for many years to come. At some point, some investment will be needed, and the PUC has plans that it has been, updates on a regular basis for water and sewer and other infrastructure, and they account for all this planned growth. For instance, their urban water management plan that was adopted in 2021, they update this every 5 years, already was using these long-range projections on growth, and so they are well aware of the projected growth and have laid out a long-term plan for meeting those needs. In terms of other areas, the city, there are many city agencies which are responsible, like the PUC, in planning for various kinds of infrastructure. The Recreation and Park Departments has a long-range plan that it bonds every few years and looks at other resources to expand and improve its park system. Someone asked a question about hospitals. The planning department works with the Department of Public Health to update a health services master plan every few years that looks at the needs for medical facilities in the city and looks at projected growth. So, for instance, these projections were used in the most recent healthcare services master plan. So there are many long-range plans that city agencies look to, and we coordinate on a regular basis with all those agencies to make sure that they're accounting for this growth in their plans.
Thank you, Joshua. And before I let you go on that same topic, we got a very specific question on Lombard and this very key artery for commuters coming from other parts of the city. So to dig in a little bit deeper to transit and transportation, how are we going to deal with these places that are already congested? More development is going to increase this idea that more development might increase more congestion and traffic in these areas.
The reality is that a lot of the traffic, we recognize that, yes, there's some of these arteries are congested. 19th Avenue, Lombard, for instance. The reality is a lot of this traffic, I think, as noted by the commenter, is from people driving in through the city. These aren't necessarily San Franciscans, going about their daily business that is congesting these arteries. One of the key ways that the city can help the region avoid increasing the amount of traffic on these corridors is to build housing in San Francisco, so that people aren't commuting into the city, can take transit to work if they don't work from home, can walk or take transit to their local shops, and that's that's the way that the state encourages us to sort of reduce the transportation loads on our systems. and reduce greenhouse gas emissions and just grow sustainably is to build housing in places that are well served by transit and walkable communities with shops and things where people can meet their needs in their neighborhoods as much as possible. We are also working on the city is working on an update to our long-range transportation vision, working on an update to the transportation element to the general plan, and working with our sister agencies of the SFMTA and the County Transportation Authority on these long-range these plans that are planning for this level of growth and looking at how the transportation system can be invested in over the coming years to deal with it. I'll just add that growth will happen organically and over time. It's not like all of this housing will drop on these neighborhoods at one time, and so there is time to see how circulation patterns might change or how people's travel behavior changes, and to upgrade service on bus lines or reroute bus lines and add infrastructure over the years.
Thank you, Joshua. Now we're going to switch over to talk more about objective design standards. So Trent, some of our participants are asking more about how the objective design standards will be applied. So will they be applied to all zoning districts where housing is permitted, or will they only be applied in our rezoned areas? And how about we start off with that?
Yeah, thanks, David. The current effort is the corridor design standards will be within the rezoned area for the high resource neighborhoods. Of course, the state is increasingly requiring ministerial approval of projects. So standards, objective design standards will be, frankly, ultimately applied to almost all projects, I think. But for this effort, they are applied within the rezone area. So essentially, ministerial approval will mean that there's essentially no design review. Any current planner can take a look at the plan set and they can, check whether a project meets a particular standard or not. So it removes all of the discretion that's currently applied with the urban design guidelines that would currently be used for reviewing projects. So it will allow for a much more streamlined review process.
And considering that, could you clarify a little bit more of how these objective design standards would relate to existing design guidelines? And even though Japantown is not in our area, how would they relate to very specific place-based design standards or guidelines?
Yeah, I mean, obviously with standards versus guidelines, there are benefits and drawbacks to each. Frankly, what design guidelines, including, for example, Japantown or Kai 24, they allow us to look at sort of the unique character of each neighborhood and provide recommendations on how to sort of incorporate that into new design. Standards are more limited in their ability to do that. They can address things such as scale and relative to existing development and so forth, but to some degree it will be, frankly, it'll be up to the designer to incorporate elements of that community into it. So, with ministerial approval, there frankly will be some nuance that is lost in the ability to respond to unique conditions of different neighborhoods. Those other guidelines are still in use currently that are outside of this rezoned area. But, yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Trent. And now going back to the larger program and speaking about kind of our approach, a couple of our participants asked about the state density bonus program and asking about the approach of, as the state density bonus program has been used successfully to build housing, why provide something that competes with it, or why remove affordable housing as kind of an incentive to create more housing through our local program. So Lisa, if you could help us clarify some of those arguments and ideas that we're developing as part of our local program.
Yeah, sure. And I know we only touched on these topics very briefly. We are planning to come out in the new year with more information about the local program specifically. But I would first say that we're not precluding the use of the state density bonus. So when we showed that height, we really are saying these are the final intended heights, and then essentially we're going to create some base zoning changes, and then projects will have the flexibility of choosing either our local program or our state program. We're trying to make the local program as attractive as possible. And I kind of just want to correct a misconception. And I think in some of the questions, we're not getting rid of affordable housing requirements. Both the state program, which is actually it's predicated on providing on-site affordable housing, and our local program will continue to have requirements around affordability. Just one of the key things that we're trying to do is we're trying to create more flexibility around affordability in particular. As I noted, the state program, we really need to do on-site affordable in order to get the bonus. Through our program, we're trying to create more options. We have seen, a drop in revenues for MoCD funded, that's Mayor's Office of Housing funded projects because of the state density bonus. And so, we want to kind of create just more parity between the two options. And then also the local program is another way that we can bring in some of our other policy priorities. So for example, the objective design standards. So, those will apply throughout the rezoned areas, but through the state program, you can, waive out of a lot of our code requirements. Through the local program, you will have to meet those requirements in order to be part of that process. So it's a fine balance. There's kind of a give and take process. We're trying to incentivize people to use our program. And, at the same time, know that we have to compete with a state program that offers a lot of flexibility, as Trent has noticed.
Thank you, Lisa. When we're getting a couple of questions from different community members about what this rezoning could mean for connecting lots. So as we know, on the west side, there are many lots that are smaller, and so some people are asking if a property owner decides to sell and a developer wants to buy adjoining lots to create a larger development, how are we considering the impact of these potentially larger developments in these neighborhoods? Or are there going to be limitations on kind of combining parcels to create larger developments, and then the impacts of that on the neighborhood?
I can start it, and then, this may be a question for Trent as well, but, land assembly will be possible. But I think just the kind of the core question is what's likely to happen, right? So I think that's been a big part of our strategy of keeping the focus on the corridors, is that is really where there are the larger sites that are more ripe for development. That, on some of the corridors, there are maybe 1-story commercial buildings, for example, parking lots and things like that. So even though, there are some of these smaller lots and lots that actually have housing on them that are included in some of these areas, they are, far less likely to develop. But in terms of just the impacts, I think the objective design standards that Trent is working on are meant to accommodate a range of conditions, as he's kind of shown with, the L-shaped configurations and, the different adjacency conditions. So I mean, I think we are baking that in as well.
Thank you, Lisa. Anything else to add on that, Trent, or shall we move on?
Yeah, I think Lisa mostly covered it. We are anticipating, sites being assembled, and that, a lot of the largest sites are on the corridors, and, we'll be looking at, for very long facades, modulating them and breaking them up so they don't feel like sort of mega projects, when the scale of other projects is more fine grained. So these are things we are thinking about and incorporating.
Thank you. And I know we are running up to the end of our time. So I wanted to ask one question that came up about parking minimums and what developing without parking minimums could mean. Does this mean more bike lanes? Does this mean more car share? If we can speak on that and, kind of what this could mean for residents and their need to park their vehicles.
I'll take a first cut. I started to answer that question in the Q&A online. I guess first I'll just start by saying that while there are no government mandated minimum parking requirements for these buildings, that there are none citywide, there are allowances to build parking, and we would anticipate that project sponsors building projects in many of these neighborhoods will opt to build parking with units based on the expectation that they will want to be able to market and rent or sell units in these neighborhoods, and many of the people who live there would have that need or expectation. And so I wouldn't say that because there are no minimum requirements that we force people to build that no parking will be built in these buildings. So I think that's very important to understand. And I guess I'll just reiterate, go back to the previous answer to on transportation more generally, is that the SFMTA, the planning department, other agencies, work diligently both in the near term and the long term to look at how to make our streets more walkable and bikeable and livable, and to make transit work more effectively and efficiently and reliably. That's a big part of our work and the city's work, and would be looking to, as these neighborhoods densify, more people move in, certainly there would be more focus on bringing those resources and positive improvements to these locations. So if you're interested, there are ongoing processes. There's an active communities plan that the SFMTA is working on, and other efforts. And so we'd be happy to plug people into current efforts going on or future efforts.
Thank you, Joshua, and thank you to everyone for your questions and comments. We just keep getting more really great questions that are really showing us that we can continue to clarify and share more information out to the community. So we encourage you all to continue to be in contact with us. And as our team shared out our contact information in the chat, and you have it here on the screen as well. If you're a part of a community organization and would like to meet with our team, we'd be very glad to meet with you all in the remainder of this year or next year. So please be in touch. And again, just wanted to thank our panelists for your time and sharing our work, and for all of our community members for these great questions. It always improves the quality of our work to get your perspectives and questions that we truly take into account throughout our process. So with that, thank you to everyone, and have a great rest of your day, and we will be in touch. Take care.